Hello, I'm Zainab Badawi, and welcome to the Emmanuel Centre in London for this Intelligence Square debate on artificial intelligence and the threat it poses to our jobs, how much of a threat it poses to our jobs. Now, experts predict that millions and millions of jobs could be taken over by a computer or a robot in the next 20 years. And the question is, how worried should we be? Could this lead to mass unemployment, greater inequalities, even social unrest? Or should we look forward to the day when computers or robots can match or even outperform humans? So our motion today is, be afraid, be very afraid. The robots are coming and they will destroy our livelihoods. And we have a great panel arguing for and against the motion. So Andrew Keane is an internet entrepreneur, author and global commentator on all things digital, and also arguing for the motion, George Magnus, independent economist and commentator who served as chief economist of UBS, the bank. Against the motion, Walter Isaacson, best known for his acclaimed biography of Steve Jobs, and Pippa Malmgren is co-founder of H Robotics, which makes drones for commercial purposes. That is our panel. Welcome to you all. You're going to hear from our four panelists make their opening arguments, and then I will throw the debate open to the audience. As you were all coming into the hall today, you were asked to vote on the motion to see where you stand, and then we're going to ask you to vote again at the end of the debate to see if opinions have shifted. So let's have our first speaker arguing for the motion, Andrew Keane, Executive Director of the Silicon Valley Salon Futurecast. Andrew's been described as the Antichrist of Silicon Valley. And in his latest book, The Internet is Not the Answer, he argues that the Internet is having a disastrous impact on our lives. Please make your way to the lectern.
So I got some good and bad news, and since we're in England, we'll start with the good news, because we always need to end with the bad news. The good news, from your point of view, and of course I'm arguing that we should be scared, but there's one thing we shouldn't be scared of. We don't need to fear that in 20 or 30 or even 50 years, we will become, as human beings, indistinguishable from computers. In other words, in 50 years, we could all be here, it could be like a science fiction movie, and we won't know whether you're sitting next to a computer or not. So that's the good news. You don't have to worry about singularity. But that doesn't mean we should not be fearful of robots. That doesn't mean that we have a lot to be scared about. Just because we're not about to become indistinguishable from robots doesn't mean they're about to take away our livelihood. And I'm guessing that many of you are lawyers or doctors, journalists, people trained in a field. You probably went to university. You spent years acquiring your intelligence, your skill, your intellect, and you sell that skill as a teacher, as a doctor, as an accountant, as a lawyer. Your value in the economy is based on that expertise. And it is you, I'm afraid, who have the most to fear from this great revolution. The digital revolution, which one set of economists call our second machine age, because this is as profound, as earth-shaking, as culturally, socially, and above all else, economically profound as the first industrial revolution of the 19th century. What we're on the brink of is a world of increasingly intense, sophisticated artificial intelligence. In Silicon Valley, where I'm from, we call it the machine learning revolution. It's the revolution of algorithms, not the traditional science fiction old-fashioned H.G. Wells notion, Doctor Who, of the robot trundling along the street, the Dalek. Get that image out of your mind. Think of the algorithm. Think of the self-driving car. Think of Google. Think of these incredible new technologies which are coming out of Silicon Valley, which are essentially replacing human labor, skilled human labor. Because here's the paradox. It's really hard for computers to replicate what seems to us to be simple tasks. Simple tasks like doing the garden, the washing up, cooking, cutting someone's hair. But on the other hand, and here is the dark, scary, horrific element to the new world we're about to enter, it's not difficult to do what seems to us, at least, to be the difficult things. The bad news, and this is really bad news for most of you, and especially for your kids because they are trying to follow in your footsteps, is that this world is about to be swept away by the digital revolution. Machines will learn how to diagnose diseases. What does that say for all doctors around the world? We already have software now that grades essays. What becomes of school teachers? What becomes of university teachers? 2 researchers at Oxford University have argued that over the next 10 years, 47% of our jobs will become irrelevant. And those 47%, I'm afraid, for you guys, are your kind of jobs. And it's not just skilled labor. It's not just the professional class. It's not just those people who have been fortunate or unfortunate enough to go to university. We have a large audience, a television audience, from the developing world. These are people who are embracing education, who see it as a way out of poverty. I'm afraid the news is really troubling for them because they missed the bus. Development, which was always taken for granted, no longer will happen. And we have these increasing inequalities in Silicon Valley because all the wealth is going to the platform companies. All the wealth is going to companies like Amazon and Google and the other companies that have harnessed this technology for their own benefit. What we're seeing is a hollowing out of the middle class, a hollowing out of the kind of jobs that you guys have depended on, and a replacement by the algorithm, by the machine, and by a tiny group of people who own and control that machine. That's the reason, I'm afraid, why you should be afraid, very afraid. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our second speaker is speaking against the motion, Walter Isaacson. And Walter became famous for his internationally acclaimed book on the life of Steve Jobs, and he gained unprecedented access to Steve Jobs in the last months of his life. He's also president and CEO of the Aspen Institute in Washington, and a former chairman and CEO of CNN and the managing editor of Time magazine. How do you fit it all in? Thank you for making the time for us today. Your time starts when you get to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I have good news for you and good news. The good news is you don't have to be afraid, and the other piece of good news is there's no bad news in this. The future is really going to be cool. Since my distinguished opponent, Mr. Keynes, started with the Industrial Revolution and said that this new revolution would be as disruptive as the Industrial Revolution, let me begin by reminding you that the Industrial Revolution wasn't all that bad. And at the end of it, we had more jobs, not fewer jobs. Technology can indeed be disruptive. It can disrupt certain jobs, as Mr. Keynes has said, but it always has, and I submit always will, produce more jobs because it produces more wealth, more personal income, more per capita wealth, and thus more things that we can make and buy. Every succeeding generation has had a new wave of worry, dire warnings that jobs are being threatened. But in each one of these cases, they turned out to be wrong. I was at Time magazine, and I went back to look 50 years ago to this date almost. Time magazine did a cover, just like the line that we're looking at. It said, "The robots are coming. Automation will take your job." It quoted a rather famous economic historian, Robert Hallbrunner. Most of you have heard of him. He says, "The new technology is threatening a whole new group of skills." Sounded just like Mr. Keene. He said the calculating, the remembering, the comparing, the okaying skills, the preserve of the office worker will go away, and machines will invade society to make that type of human labor redundant. Well, guess what? It's been 50 years, and since then, soon after he wrote that, we had the greatest leaps of technology you can imagine. The internet, the personal computer, and the microprocessor all come into play. But nobody has been rendered redundant. There's more jobs and more types of jobs now than there were 50 years ago. As Mark Andreessen, the person who invented the web browser, said, just as most of us today have jobs that weren't invented 100 years ago, the same will be true 100 years from now. Let me give some examples. There's the app economy. It began in 2008 when Steve Jobs was convinced by other members of his management team to allow outsiders to create apps for the iPhone and then the iPad. The App Store alone since then has created 627,000 jobs. The app economy last year was $100 billion, far surpassing the film industry. This is an industry that did not exist 7 years ago. Other advances in technology have helped facilitate new forms of work, such as the sharing economy, where people both here, New York, New Orleans, can drive cars, be part of Uber, be part of Airbnb, be part of Lyft. Likewise, online marketplaces such as Amazon and eBay have enabled the rise of artisans, makers, the type of people that existed in the pre-industrial age, people who had creative instincts and then could have connections to customers around the world. If you create a book or a song now, you have new ways to publish, as Pippa did with her own book, new ways to distribute. If you dream up a new specialty, this world allows you to find customers and provide a service, just as if you were an artisan or a service maker in the pre-industrial revolution. It even helps long-established companies find markets all over the globe. There's a more fundamental shift going on in the economy that's also good. We're creating an on-demand or on-tap economy. If you need a housekeeper or a handyman, you don't have to go to a particular firm to get it. It can be done on tap. If new technologies reduce the total number of jobs, we'd all be out of work now. And I doubt that Mr. Keene, nor I, nor you can guess what wondrous jobs technology will bring to our great-grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Walter. Our second speaker for the motion is economist George Magnus. After a long career in finance in the City of London, George has turned to writing, and he's written The Age of Aging, a study of how demographics are changing the world economy and social systems. So George, please make your way to the lectern and tell us what you think.
Thank you very much. So we're going to talk economics now, okay? Not populism. And what I'd like to put to you this evening is that these digital and robotic technologies constitute a very powerful economic threat to our livelihoods because of its effect on jobs, on income distribution, and because they demand that we focus on coping mechanisms that we do not yet have. Now, our opponents in this debate, and you've already heard the first, will try to convince you that because mankind has always adapted to new technologies historically, we shouldn't fear the robotic revolution. But this time, as they say, it really is different. And I'm going to tell you why. So just over 200 years ago, 64 men went on trial in York. These Luddites, they went on a rampage, they burned mills and machinery and so on, but their campaign, as we know, was myopic because the Industrial Revolution, or the first Industrial Revolution, did leave us all better off. What we did is we harnessed power, and that exposed the limits of human brawn. But it was also complementary to human endeavor. This is the key point. It allowed us to blend men and machines in ways which boosted employment, growth, income, and sustained a rising and prosperous middle class. The modern technological revolution is different. It's exposing the limits not of human brawn, but of human brain. And instead of being complementary, modern technology is displacing us. Capital is being substituted more and more for labor, threatening jobs, living standards, and, as we know from contemporary political debate, the fabric of the middle class. Not all jobs, of course, are at risk, as you've already heard. Machines are not sufficiently dexterous to do all kinds of manual work, and lots of human cognitive and judgmental skills have not been replicated by machines and may not. But they've already been doing routine-based or rule-based jobs on the factory floor and in offices for some time. Since 2010, the number of low-paying and high-paying jobs has gone up, but the number of middle-level jobs, middle-wage paying jobs, has stagnated or dropped in a pattern that is replicated across the whole of Europe, in the United States, and indeed in some emerging countries, notably in China and India. Successful capitalism needs us to be fully engaged, not just as gadget-savoring consumers, which we all are, but also as producers. In other words, we need to have stable, productive, high levels of employment, which is what robotics is undermining. And because capitalism rewards scarcity, and because the robotics revolution is generating productivity gains that are benefiting a limited number of people, the principal rewards of modern technology are accruing to the owners of capital, not the owners of labor in the main. Think about the three biggest firms in Silicon Valley. They have 137,000 people, and these three companies have a market capitalization, in other words, they're worth $1.2 trillion. Now just cast your mind back 25 years to 1990. The three biggest companies in Detroit had 10 times as many workers, 1.2 million, and their combined market value was a mere $36 billion. This fundamental change in the relationship between capital and labor is also illustrated by what we see in lots of surveys about the rising share of profits in national income and the declining share of wages. Because as economic inequality rises, so political inequality rises, and those that benefit from more political power obviously seek changes which further their own economic advantage, and you could easily end up, without coping mechanisms, at a very kind of dystopian political future. I would remind you of the quip from Lord Keynes, the famous British economist, who quipped that, in the long run, we're all dead, by which he meant that the economists' focus on the long-run equilibrium was a waste of time because economic circumstances affect us now, next year, in the next few years, not at some vague point in the unmeasurable future. And that's really what is important and brings me to my final point, which is that we need to think about this really seriously and try to develop coping mechanisms. There could be many. Better education, better training, improved access to capital, job protection schemes for certain occupations, higher minimum wage, direct transfers, labor-intensive construction, taxation of capital to help displaced workers, and so on. I'm not commending, ladies and gentlemen, any particular coping mechanism to you tonight, merely pointing out that we have few and need many as the robotics revolution evolves.
Thank you very much indeed, George Magnus. Well, another economist now speaking against the motion, Pippa Malmgren. Well, as well as creating flying robots, she runs the DRPM group, which advises institutional investors on politics and policy. And she was also an advisor on financial markets to President George W. Bush. So please make your way to the lectern, because the floor is yours now, Pippa. Thank you.
So the Buddhists say that suffering comes from having an argument with reality. This is reality. We can talk about how artificial intelligence, robotics is going to change our lives, but the danger is that we confuse the fact that the world economy makes these relentless demands for change, and that is universal. That is no change to the past whatsoever. As an economist, I can see that the demand for change on us is deeply painful. But what technology does is empowers us to adapt and to take advantage of our ability to engage in new forms of economic activity. And that is why this reality is so very, very important. I think the bottom line is that we have to understand we've just had roughly 100 years of fast advancing technological change. We've had 30 years of a software revolution. We now have as much power in an iPad as used to be only in a defense lab. That is now at everyone's fingertips. And with that, we now commence a hardware revolution, physical items. This is all part of what new technology empowers us to do. I take you to the case of Jenny Doan, who runs a fantastic quilting company in Missouri. This is a woman who is getting 30 million YouTube hits for showing people how to make quilts, a very old-fashioned activity, but not possible without computers, without the artificial intelligence to make the pieces the right size, to sew them together quickly. She employs 85 people. 300 people a day come from around the world to go to her shop in the middle of Missouri. As someone who's in the robotics industry, I can tell you most of the innovation that's occurring in this field is not coming from the big companies. It's coming from the hobbyists. It's coming from people who are just playing with these things because they can, they have the power to, and it's interesting and it's fun. When you even listen to the senior management at places like Apple, they will say most of our innovation is coming from small groups of a few people, principally working out of a garage somewhere. This is a hugely democratic movement that is beginning to permit people to enter into the cutting edge of what's happening in the world economy without having to have elite skills. To that end, I have to say, as someone who's actually employing people in this business, what there's a shortage of out there is not intellectual capability or high levels of education and training. There's a shortage of people who have the practical skills, who know how to make an engine work, who know how to do electrical wiring. I mean, there are a lot of educated idiots, and I may be one of them because I have lots of degrees, but I can't change the tap washer when it goes wrong. We need more people who can do these things because they're the ones who the technology empowers to do something. Robotics and artificial intelligence won't destroy jobs. They are the tools by which we will build the jobs we're going to have tomorrow. And they'll be different than the ones we do today, and thank goodness, because that will be much more interesting, exciting, and draw on our capabilities much more than anything else we can imagine. And with that, I'll finish.
Thank you very much indeed, Pippa Malmgren. So we're going to go to the audience in a moment, but first of all, let me bring you the pre-debate vote, how you, the audience here in London at the Emmanuel Centre, voted on our motion today in this Intelligence Squared debate. The robots are coming and they will destroy our livelihoods. Of course, we are talking about robotic and digital technology in general, not just the robots. This is how the audience here voted. For the motion, 31%. Against the motion, 42%, and the don't knows are 27%. So I would say, panel, that it is quite finely balanced, and we'll have to see how the audience vote at the end of our debate. So now let me see who wants to make an intervention or put a question from the floor, and briefly, if you would also, who's got the microphone? Go ahead.
As a technological optimist, I was a little bit disappointed with the arguments against today. You know, the advent of strong artificial intelligence, which could be real human-level intelligence, has the potential to actually completely replace what humans are doing, not just enhance it. And it seemed that argument was completely lost and ignored. And actually, I ended up agreeing with George that we need to accept that and think about how that will fundamentally change the world and change society, and not just ignore that fact.
So you've moved from being a technological optimist. Are you now a technological pessimist?
No, I'm still an optimist. I just think we have to think about it.
Thank you. We don't wish to depress you and bring you down at all. Okay, any other? Do please, yeah.
Thank you. One conclusion I make from the title is, regardless of whether to be afraid or not afraid, I think there is consensus that it's coming. So the change is coming and nobody can stop it. The question I'm posing to all panelists is, how do we mitigate the challenges coming from the robots coming in? So far, that has not been addressed. Perhaps we can address it. Thank you.
Maybe Andrew Keane, do you want to look at that? I mean, I suppose that brings us to regulation or how governments should respond. Do we need legislation? That's the point there.
What we need to remember about the Industrial Revolution, that when that happened, when you had child labor, when you had terrible pollution, when you had the uncontrolled consequences of the early Industrial Revolution, the market didn't resolve things. It was the government that had to step in, the grown-ups. And if we leave it to the children, to the Zuckerbergs and the Thiels of this world, then I fear that the thing will get even worse. The problem is also with politicians. They're too slow. There are two speeds in the world today. There's the hyper-speed of Silicon Valley, and there's the hyper-slowness of political bodies in Washington, D.C. So we can't necessarily slow Silicon Valley down, but we can certainly speed up the traditional political authorities.
Pippa, do you want to respond to Andrew?
Yeah, I would take exactly the opposite side of that and say what we want to do is speed up the integration of humanity into technology. We want to bring people into this space faster. There's a global shortage right now, for example, of welders. They're hiring people in their 70s to work with modern robotics because welding still is a skill. A robot can't replicate what a human knows about this. The human nuance and knowledge of how things work is still essential in the application of robotics.
What does your side say? In some regions of the world stand to benefit more than others, surely?
Well, but this is the normal case of the world economy. It's a fluid, moving thing, and we should stop thinking about national boundaries. We should think more about, on a global basis, where do we see economic activity occurring? And I think the more dispersed it is, the better.
That's a very kind of romantic view, which I would applaud as well, but I just don't think it's right. So I'll give you a classic case, right? I mean, we all wonder at at China and its magnificent achievements over the last 25 years. But I think China was unique, right? India wants to basically build up India's manufacturing base based on essentially around low-value products, over the next 25 years to become a China. It's just not going to happen because the technology is going to pass them by. They need to find new solutions to the problems they've got.
Andrew, briefly.
I just want to come back at what Pippa said because I think she should cross sides. She's making our argument for us. She's not mentioning lawyers or doctors or accountants or teachers. All we hear from her is welders. Robots aren't able to become welders. Big deal. There isn't enough jobs out there for everyone to become welders or plumbers. The problem is the profound skilled labor that represented the backbone of our meritocratic, middle-class economy. And from these guys, all I hear are entrepreneurs, I hear app developers, I hear welders. I don't hear the dignity of labor that represented the core of 20th century life.
So here's the question to the audience. Would you rather have your surgeon have more precision? If you would rather have a surgeon that has more precision, then you are in favor of the human element guiding the technology. You are in favor of a world in which the human being still has an essential role to play, but the technology makes what we do better.
Briefly, and then I'll come back to the next one.
I do think that we've always thought that AI was coming ever since about 1956, and it always is a little bit harder than we think. So whether it is domain awareness or creativity, the humans have a way of cognitive thinking that is so fundamentally different in its carbon-based wetware system of our brain than in the digital silicon system, that artificial intelligence remains a mirage, and it's not about to change everything. Our creativity, our humanism, will always be part of the party.
All right, okay, let's take some more points from the floor. Who's got a microphone?
Yeah, I voted against the motion at the start, but I have to say that those speaking against it have engaged in a whitewash. I'd like to ask them, what do they think robots will not be able to do in 30 years' time?
Okay, thanks. We take another one. There was a chap in the red, yeah.
I think the party against is saying that we don't have to worry because we just need to have faith in human creativity. So I put it to the panel, how about a shed for every man in England?
A what?
Shed.
Yeah, uh-huh.
I've got 5 schoolboys here aged between 10 and 13, the next generation. We'd like to know if each member of the panel would recommend a job for them to do.
Okay. If you could stand.
I had a question actually, with maybe the exception of Pippa, how many of the panelists have actually walked the floors of a robotics laboratory? Because if you do, I mean, you take a company like Toy Talk based in Silicon Valley, they hire everyone from Pixar writers to animation experts to engineers to marketing people. I mean, it's a very diverse cross-disciplinary function, the likes of which we've not seen in technology. And what's your view of that?
Right, let's take some of those then. I think we can collapse the 5 schoolboys, what kind of jobs they might do with that question about what robots can't do in 30 years. And
let me just
all right,
say, I
then.
think
You want to pick up this
gave
lady?
the answer in a way. If you're going to be looking for a job as, you know, a 5th grader or whatever, be creative. What will computers, robots not do that we can do? They work by algorithm, almost by definition. They are not creative. They don't think out of the box. They don't think imaginatively. Our minds are cognitive, so we supply intelligence squared debaters. No robot is going to replace this panel, but nor will it replace the Pixar people and the animation people and the people doing the creativity. And if you learn to code and connect the arts to the sciences, that was Steve Jobs' great advice.
So the welders and the plumbers are creative?
They are creative, but I would say take the shed that the guy in the back recommended, give it to the 5 boys, give them an iPad and the technology that they need, and then let them learn a lot of different things, because you aren't going to have one job. You're going to have many jobs. You aren't going to have one career. You're going to have many careers. That is what technology allows.
The bottom line, though, to answer your question as well, madam, is that the kinds of things that technology companies are doing actually employ very, very few people. It's what do you do with the people in Bradford or in the slums of Mumbai and so on and so forth. Those are the people that are really going to suffer from this.
Let me respond, because it's a great question about kids, what they should and shouldn't do. I don't know what to tell you to do, but I can give you 2 pieces of advice about what not to do. So the first is don't become a welder. The second, and this is even more serious than not becoming a welder. Don't get a shed, and don't listen to Pippa about this idea that somehow we should all go into sheds and innovate and become the next entrepreneur. We only hear about the Zuckerbergs and the Jobs of Silicon Valley. But for every Zuckerberg, there are hundreds of thousands of failures. So we cannot encourage everyone to go into their shed and become entrepreneurs. That's the ultimate seduction, and I think we will regret it.
All right. More questions from the audience, please. Lady here with the scarf. If you could stand, please.
Mr. Isaacson, you referred to musicians being able to make music in all these ways. Well, yes, they can use their iPhones and record a track, but they can't pay a mortgage, they can't feed their children on the money they're going to get back from it. That's the first point. And the second is institutions and projects in the media that encourage us to tweet, to Facebook, to use social media, to promote what they're doing, but none of us are getting paid for that. And there seems to be more and more and more of expecting the general population to do an awful lot for absolutely nothing, and we have to buy the kit to do it with.
Thank you. I know that's something Andrew's written about. Yeah. Yes, gentleman there, if you could stand.
I had some life-saving surgery before Christmas, and it did involve a lot of animatronics and laser work, but I tell you, the next morning in my morphine-induced stupor, I would not have wanted a robot to come into my room and tell me I was going to live.
Okay, thank you.
It seems to me that there is a deeper underlying question here that none of you have really addressed, which is what kind of society we want and what work is for in the first place. Because some people also talk about moving to a post-work world where we can be more efficient because of all of these tools, and we can maybe just have a 2-day work week instead and having more like social economy.
Would you like that? What do you do? 2-day week?
I'm from Denmark, so maybe that's why I'm a bit...
What? Don't they work in Denmark or something? I'm sure they do very hard. Okay, well... Who wants to take that? What is work for? I mean, you're talking about preserving jobs.
I'll take the Danish gentleman's question.
Yeah.
This interesting thing, in 1930-ish, Lord Keynes actually wrote a little pamphlet called The Economic Consequences for Our Grandchildren. And he looked forward 100 years, and actually he imagined a period when productivity of the people that were employed was so high that actually it was able to support everybody or pretty much everybody, in a life of just considerably expanded leisure. But you're right. Yeah. There may be a point in the future when that will be true, but it can't see it happening.
Well, the gentleman from Denmark stood up and said, "Why do you want to work?" The answer is obvious: to earn a living, to be paid, to pay your mortgage, to feed your children. It's how we make sure that our children have good lives.
All right.
So without jobs, things are pretty bad. We'll just end up in sheds.
There was a point, on that point, about the chap who had the life-saving surgery and said he would not have wanted to woken up the next morning with a robot telling him that the operation had gone well. I mean,
that gets to the point of what are humans good for in the future. And it's things like interpersonal skills, which George has mentioned, the type of understanding of nuances and creativity that come from being able to understand a patient or being a legal client or whatever, the type of things that machines have never done, and we see no evidence that they would do better.
Are we sure that emotional intelligence, the empathy gene, is not something that machines or robots could do in the future?
In a digital on-off manner. We have never seen it happen. I know people trying to create robots that smile at you.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever wanted one of those to wake up in the morning once they've had an operation. The combination of human strengths, cognitive strengths, combined with the tools of technology will always outstrip robots working alone or humans working alone. And what we have seen throughout the digital revolution is that there are certain things that humans are really good at and certain things machines are good at. And when you can make that partnership, that's when you have the great leaps. But it always provides a role, whether it's for the lawyer or the doctor or the artist or the musician, to do something that can't be done better by a machine working alone.
Okay, briefly, Pippa, then we'll go back to the floor.
Look at some of the greatest innovations of our time. If we look at the MIT Media Lab, where they're doing extraordinary work in all these areas, we're now able to grow food in a container using no soil, almost no water, very few chemicals, virtually no fertilizer, and only a little bit of light that's from the particular part of the spectrum the plant needs. You grow it 4 to 8 times faster than in real life, and you get higher nutritional content and higher taste. Now, you cannot ask a computer to create that. Human beings create that. Computers can execute based on algorithms once you've decided what it is you need executed. But to solve the problems our society faces, that still is about human ingenuity.
All right, let's just take a couple more interventions from the floor. There, yeah.
Hello. My question is for all of the speakers, really, and it is, should this be a gendered debate? That is the inevitable growth in artificial intelligence going to help or hinder our progression towards female economic and social equality?
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. I think this argument's getting a little complex. Personally, referring to the lady talking about welding, there is a situation where we have human beings as welders. Do you think corporations, if they could, employ robots, which would be cheaper, they would?
Thank you. And yeah, I think that's probably the final one I can go to there. Yeah, if you could stand.
I'm just wondering, we've spoken a lot about sort of jobs like teaching, law, medicine, entrepreneurialism, but I'm curious what will happen to jobs like train drivers, bus drivers, people that work in supermarkets. I mean, even all the drivers of Uber, will they need to exist in 30, 50 years' time?
Yeah, well, we know that there are plans for unmanned driverless cars, and Uber are looking at that too. So I'll just take that gentleman there because he's had his hand up for a long time. Sorry, the chap in the spectacles there, yeah.
We've heard that machines might usurp and therefore are dangerous. We've heard machines cannot be more intelligent, they can just complement. But what if there's a third way? And that our evolutionary roadmap was meant to lead us to a place where we create something that can evolve itself, can be far more intelligent and better than us, more competent, more benevolent, and we should embrace this and look to something far better than we are.
I think that's Turkey's voting for Christmas there, isn't it? That final point there. Thank you very much. So you've... Just to develop that question about women, I mean, a lot of the world's menial jobs and back-breaking work that a lot of African women farmers do, for instance, that kind of thing, you know, is this, how do you see the advancement of technological jobs and skills helping them?
Let's look at a guy I know, Iqbal Kadir, founded the first mobile phone network in Bangladesh. And who did he go to hand out the physical phones? The oldest woman in every remote village in Bangladesh, because she was the power center in those communities, and he taught those women how to use the phones so that the local community could figure out how much they get paid for their produce when they took it into the big city. This is very empowering stuff. This notion that somehow everybody gets left behind by technology, it simply doesn't add up in the data. It doesn't show in our investment strategies where we're all investing in this all over the world.
It does add up. And you can't solve the world's problems by anecdote. It doesn't work.
You can solve the world's problem by technology.
Just 1 second. You cannot solve the world's problems by anecdote.
And a Nobel Prize was won over that activity. That is not an anecdote.
No, you've had your say. I was going to address the lady who's asked the question about females earlier on. But what it did remind me is that in the first industrial revolution, the only way that, we had to have a social revolution as well as an industrial revolution. Otherwise, the whole thing would have fallen apart. And some of the things that happened as a consequence of the social revolution, Andrew mentioned one of them before, which was the abolition of child labor. The emancipation of women was also part of that. right? That didn't happen. I mean, women had to agitate for that, and eventually governments had to legislate for it.
Yeah, but the question was, how far would robotic and digital technology empower women all over the world to release them from
my view would
menial
be,
jobs?
on its own, it will not be sufficient. It will need the intervention of institutions and governments to make that happen properly.
You know, Zainab, I think that's
you won't
the
have a
key.
right to reply. Go ahead, Pippa.
That's the key. All of us have to make a philosophical decision. Does the answer lie in human effort, or does the answer lie in the state with smart people up at the top? I worked in the White House. I've been one of those people they call those smart guys in Washington. I don't believe that the state is better at determining what the outcome ought to be than all of our personal collective decisions. But that's the choice that you and the audience have to make.
Okay, thank you. So, I now have the results of the post-debate vote. Let me just remind you how you voted, audience, when you came in to the hall. For the motion, the robots are coming and they will destroy our livelihoods. 31% for the motion, 42% against the motion, 27% don't know. After the debate, for the motion, 43%. Against the motion, 52%. And the don't know is 5%. So it seems to me that the for the motion gained 12 percentage points and against the motion gained 10 percentage points. So it's the, in the audience, it's the against the motion, the robots are coming and destroy our livelihoods. They're obviously more sanguine about it. So I think, in a sense, both sides have won. So clearly. So clearly, anyway, there's been agreement on the increasing impact that artificial intelligence and robots will have on our lives, whether that's to the benefit or to the detriment of mankind. Well, I don't think we have consensus on that. Thank you to my panel. Thank you to my audience here. Thank you to Intelligence Squared for making this debate possible. Thank you to you, wherever you are watching this. From me, Zainab Badawi at the Emmanuel Centre in London. Goodbye.
Thank you.